asegurar la calidad. En estas dos presentaciones tengo el placer de primero presentarles a la doctora profesora Debra Nestel. Ella es profesora de educación sobre la simulación en el cuidado de la salud en la Universidad de Monash y profesora de educación quirúrgica en el Departamento de Cirugía de la Universidad de Melbourne en Australia. Ahora es editora en jefe en el International Journal of Healthcare Simulation y es directora del programa de programas de posgrado en simulación clínica en la Universidad de Monash y programas de posgrado en educación quirúrgica en la Universidad de Melbourne. Debra ha publicado más de 200 artículos revisados por pares sobre educación en profesionales de la salud, libros editados sobre metodología de pacientes simulados, simulación de atención médica, etc. Y también tengo el placer de presentarles a Cathy Smith, que ha trabajado como simuladora en la educación de profesionales de la salud durante más de 30 años. Es miembro desde sus inicios en la Asociación de Educadores de SP, la ASPE, y es la actual presidenta del Comité Internacional. Es miembro del Consejo Editorial del International Journal of Healthcare Simulation y es el subdirectora de la Red de Pacientes Simulados. Tiene publicaciones recientes revisadas por pares en los estándares de las mejores prácticas de la ASPE para los jugadores de roles humanos en la simulación, así como la investigación centrada en el trabajo con SP mayores. Debido a la dificultad horaria de la Universidad de Australia, la profesora Debra no está con nosotros, pero va a pasar el video y la doctora Cathy está aquí con nosotros para resolver cualquier duda o comentario terminando la presentación. Vamos a ver las presentaciones y al final, por favor, pueden poner sus preguntas en el chat.
Oh, good morning, Cathy. How are you?
Good. Well, it's evening here almost, but good morning to you.
So I think you're in Toronto, is that right?
Yes.
So I know that you know, but so that the delegates know, I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, and you're in Toronto, Canada, and different time zones. But here we go. I know I'm very excited to be able to share this presentation with you. And I'll just read the title there: Getting Started in Telesimulation with Simulated Patients. And it's not a mistake that we've got the word standardized there. It's just not our preference. We like to refer to simulated patients who may be able to standardize their portrayal if they're required to do so within their work. But we don't think that the word standardized really should be used as an adjective for any patient. We like patients to be individualized. So there are our names, and here we are in 2021, and I'm just going to advance my slides, and here goes. No, there. So there are two parts to this presentation. They both stand alone, so it's possible to come to one and not the other, but we hope that you'll join both. In the first part, we're going to be focusing our attention on the preparation, the briefing, and the simulation relative to online SP-based simulations. And in the second, you can see we're going to be focusing on those other really important elements of SP work, the feedback or debriefing, reflection phase, evaluation, and indeed quality assurance to really reflect on the overall quality of the simulation practice. And I might more formally introduce myself, and then I'll hand over to you, Cathy, if that's all right. So I currently have a couple of roles. I work as a professor of simulation education at Monash University, where I lead graduate programs in clinical simulation. And at Melbourne University, I sit as Professor of Surgical Education, and there I lead graduate programs in surgical education, as well as doing research and faculty development. I sit currently as Editor-in-Chief of a brand new open access journal, the International Journal of Healthcare Simulation. It is a collaboration between the India Society for Simulation in Healthcare and the Pan-Asian Network. And I'm very pleased to announce that the UK Society, ASPI, now have a formal relationship with the International Journal of Healthcare Simulation as well. That's hot off the press. I sit as director of the Simulated Patient Network, and before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm based today in Australia. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging leaders. Just a couple of disclosures to make. I received very small royalties from Wiley, Blackwell and Springer for some work that, or for books that I've been involved in. And I do make reference to one of those books today, so it's probably an important disclosure, and do consultancy work with various organizations, but particularly the SP work, have programs available through healthysimulation.com. Over to you, Cathy.
Thanks, Debra. So I am a board member of ASPI, which is the Association of Standardized Patient Educators. It is an international organization, although most of the members are based in the United States. And we're going to be talking about one of our key resources was developed by ASPI, so we'll be talking about that in a bit. I was an editor for Advances in Simulation, and I recently have become an associate editor for the International Journal of Healthcare Simulation, and I am the deputy director of the Simulated Patient Network. I would like to make a land acknowledgement. So I wish to acknowledge the land on which I am working. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And I would like to make the disclosure that I consult with various educational and assessment organizations, and I'm really pleased to be here today.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. I think we're going to move on to the core of the activity now. And can I leave you to share the learning objectives? And I think that we decided that we'd turn off our cameras so we can focus more clearly on the content, and our images not get in the way of the slides as well.
Thank you, Debra. So we have 3 learning objectives here today in part 1 of this presentation. We are going to, by the end of this presentation, our hope is that you will be able to outline fundamental considerations in SP-based education. You will be able to describe the nature and type of SP-based scenarios that are done via simulation. And also you will be able to discuss adaptations for all the people that are involved in the circle of simulation. And that includes SPs, faculty, administrators, and learners. And within those adaptations, also a strong theme that will emerge from our presentations are the importance of safety. So our hope is that you will be able to outline strategies to monitor and maintain psychological safety of all those involved in the simulation in a telehealth telesimulation environment.
Well, thanks, Cathy. As ever, we're being super ambitious with what we expect we're going to be able to achieve, but we like to work that way. So here goes. Just in order to help you meet these objectives beyond this session, I'm going to share a few resources. This is the first one. These are called the NetSim phases, and these happen to have been identified as part of a national faculty development program in Australia. So usually starting at that 12 o'clock position at preparing. So a whole lot of content to do during the preparation phase of simulation. The briefing, irrespective of simulation modality, these phases offer specific considerations, and hopefully they'll help you guide you in your work as well. Then there's the actual simulation, there's debriefing and feedback, there's the reflecting phase, and then evaluating. And the word evaluating there refers to the quality assurance processes. That is, did the simulation achieve what it was meant to achieve? And then all of the stakeholders and inputs to that. Whereas if you're talking about assessment, that's really happening in that debriefing and feedback phase. That's where we would consider assessment. For simulated patient methodology, we have added a couple of other considerations, and these are de-rolling. We like our simulated patients or participants to come out of role immediately they have finished simulating, so that they can participate as who they are, their persona during the feedback session. And before leaving us, having completed quality assurance activities, that we just check in with them that they've been able to shed their role completely. Because if you think about it, if they're playing a highly emotional role, it's going to be important that those threads are really cut so that they can leave as delightful as they were as they came into the session. And you can see that this has immediate implications for working online. It's so much easier to do this in a Often it's so much easier to do this in a face-to-face session than online, but we're going to focus on some of those sorts of strategies in the part 2 session. In part 1, we're focusing on those blue and underlined boxes, the preparing, the briefing, and the simulating. And I will move to the next slide now, which are the ASPE standards of best practice. So, Cathy, would you like to speak to these, please?
Thanks, Debra. So these are the second valuable resource that we're sharing with you. And as Debra said, these are the standards for ASPE practice that were developed by ASPE. And there were a number of authors, and there were some in working groups, and there were some people from other countries other than North America. The main number of people were from North America. You'll see in the middle, this is an infographic. In the middle, there are 5 values that underpin these standards, and you will see safety is at the top of it. And then you will see around the outside of the circle, there are 5 domains, and they're also listed at the very bottom of the information here. And these are positioned as best practices. We want to stress that they are contextual, and we find them more helpful to think of them as guidelines, as being a useful resource, but not the direct focus of a session. And we wanted you to know they're available, and there is a Spanish translation that is available for free on the ASPE website as well. Debra, I'll turn it over to you for the last resource.
Thanks so much. And I'm really glad you've made that point about the contextualization of the guidelines. Yeah, it's fabulous. They're a really useful resource, but I know that many of them don't sit really neatly within the Australian context. This is the third resource, and one that I do declare well, it's not a conflict of interest, it's just a disclosure. I was editor of the book and contributed many chapters, and Cathy also contributed chapters to the book. It was published in 2018 now, under 2016, I think.
Yes.
2016. Oh my goodness, time's passing on. And I think we need a chapter on online simulation in this book now. But one of the learning objectives today was to try to share with you some generic principles about SP practice. You'll get that from those ASPE standards. You'll get that from the content of this book. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't a Spanish translation, but I did want to flag that I think it is a valuable resource. And over to key concepts. Cathy, I think we probably should do this just to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to the things that are going to be really important to us today. And,
yeah, that's good.
Can I invite you to talk to the simulated participants or patients?
Sure. So when we refer to simulated participants, we're mainly referring to simulated patients, and the definition is of a well individual who is carefully trained to portray a person in some sort of healthcare scenario. And SPs are commonly found in OSCEs, objective structured clinical examinations, but also in a whole host of other supportive learning practices too. And SPs not only portray roles, they can also portray roles such as family members, other healthcare providers, people in the community. They are also able to provide feedback on their experience in the scenario. And this is such an invaluable lens to the learners who often don't receive this kind of feedback from real patients when they're enacting with real patients in actual clinical activities.
Oh, look, thanks so much for that description. And can we try now, even though we're probably going to be speaking about patients, simulated participants as patients in this session, mainly, not exclusively though, should we just say SPs from now on?
Yes, that sounds very good.
Let's do that. And we'll be clear if the P stands for something other than a patient. So Cathy, you've developed this slide. I know it says my name on the end there, but you've developed this slide of thinking about SPs as co-educators. So I might leave you to talk to that one as well.
Thank you, Debra. So, and Debra, you really define this term proxies for the person they represent. And this is such a huge responsibility that we have in terms of creating roles, and that SPs have in enacting them, because they are really stepping in ideally for roles that are based, or scenarios that are based on actual patients. And they provide such a crucial humanistic perspective in simulation. So key to that is their authenticity, because they are presenting an actual human being. And that authenticity can create much greater engagement in learners. At the same time, there is a tension between authenticity and another word that's often associated with SP practice, and that is standardization. And we're not really going to get into that in any great detail here today, but to think of it that standardization really we refer to it as consistency and accuracy of performance over time within an individual SP, between SPs working in the same place. So several SPs portraying one role across many tracks, or at distributed sites. But there really is a range of which SPs are asked to be standardized that range from educational settings where they have much more latitude in adapting and flexing their portrayal to learner needs, to high stakes licensing exams where the degree of consistency and accuracy is much stronger. And that's not going to be the focus of our presentation today. But even in those settings, it's finding the authenticity, the humanistic perspective, and they are co-educators. So they have important offerings at every stage of a simulation of these stages that we've shown you. And they're often, in a lot of things that are written about them, they are sometimes marginalized. They come in, they're the actors that portray a role. They are so much more than that. And that's starting to be understood more and more in the research that is emerging.
Oh, thanks very much, Cathy. That's so helpful. And I know that I often, even for SPs, I have to remind them that they are my co-teachers. We're working in this together, and that their contribution is absolutely invaluable. There's just a tiny little bit more key concepts that we want to work with. And I phrase this as a question, but like many with COVID-19, we've had to shift our SP work online, and we just wanted to check in with you about the words that are used to describe these online simulation practices. And you'll find these variations: virtual simulation, telesimulation, distance simulation, remote simulation, all in the Society for Simulation Healthcare Dictionary. And I'm not sure that as a professional community, we've settled on terms. And you can see that we've used the phrase telesimulation in the title of the presentation, but I'm just as comfortable with using the term online simulation. It just seems to be quite simple and clear. So we might just work with that for the rest of the session. What are we referring to here with this online practice? Well, really any combination of simulated participants, or SPs, learners, and faculty working through a communication platform. And the one that I work with most commonly is Zoom, although I do a little bit of work in Teams. And I'm assuming that all are working through the platform, but that's not necessarily the case. Some of them could be, and increasingly as we've stopped working from home or eased up some of the restrictions about going into the workplace, it's feasible that some of the participants could be on the online platform and some in a room together. And that all of these activities are supporting learning or assessment. And this slide is adapted from Simulation Canada, and you can see what this might look like, and it certainly represents the sort of work that I'm involved with, where I may have student observers, 3 or 4 of them, a simulated participant and a learner, and me as the facilitator, and we're all online. In this sort of small group work, I don't have the luxury of having technical assistance, but it's certainly invaluable when you can have it. And if you're working with very large groups, then having that tech assistance is invaluable. Cathy, I wonder, could you share an example from your practice in the last year of these sorts of online simulations?
Yes, there's one that I do at an organization I work with called Baycrest, and it involves neuropsychologists who are testing older adults, so adults in their 70s and 80s, for potential memory loss. And they had to shift their practice from in-person to online. And so they asked us to work with them to create simulations to help the students, the learners, and also the actual neuropsychologists be able to adapt what they did in person online. So we've done probably 20 to 30 of these over the last year. And the practice of the neuropsychologist has probably permanently shifted a lot of it to going online. So it was a very informative experience to go through to learn about how to do online simulation.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. That's really interesting. And I'm just going to share one example from my own practice, which is in this instance where the P is not standing for a patient, but for a surgical trainee. I mentioned at the beginning that I lead the graduate programs in surgical education. And the simulated participants in this example took on the role of surgical trainees who'd been noted to be underperforming. And so using Zoom in small groups, just as in the illustration on the previous page, one SP, one surgeon, two observers, and one facilitator. And we all met to address what the learning objective was: managing difficult conversations with the trainee who's underperforming. And each simulated trainee role was based on the surgeon's experiences with a real trainee. So that was really interesting work, creating that role. But the forum provided an opportunity to learn how to start this type of, difficult conversation. We'll share some more examples as the session unfolds, but thanks, Cathy, for sharing that. Just while our move online through the pandemic, particularly at the beginning, was really a band-aid, we're now at a stage where we've really got to take a careful look at our practices to ensure that they are sustainable and, of course, supportive to all participants involved. And that's what we're going to do right now. So the NetSim phases is where we've just divided the rest of the presentation into these. The focus will be on preparing, briefing, and simulating. Preparing is all of the activity that you do before your SPs, before your faculty, before your learners show up for the session. The briefing is the information that's provided to any of the stakeholders, participants involved in the simulation activity, and the simulating phase, the considerations that need to be made that are happening during the simulation itself. So, Cathy, I'm going to ask you to describe a couple of considerations in each phase as you've moved to online SP work. And I know that there are so many things we could look at, but we've had to try to confine ourselves to just a couple. So what are you going to describe?
Well, the first thing I want to talk about is scenario modifications, because there are differences between working online and face-to-face. And they're different mediums and they have unique requirements. So it's not, you can't really take a face-to-face scenario, put it online, and not think about how you have to adapt it. So one of the responsibilities of the SP educator or the SP trainer, so that's the person responsible for the SP education and for preparing the SPs and making sure that the learners understand how to work with them and the faculty, is that they need to thoroughly review the scenarios to ensure that they are able to be performed on camera. And this can relate to three different areas, many others as well, but the three we'll look at, and that's the learning objectives, the context and the content, and the affect and the behaviors of the SPs, and then also online competencies for all participants. And as COVID goes on, we're understanding more and more what these online competencies are because we've had to learn them. So could you advance to the next slide, Debra?
Sure, and I'll just make a reference. We're going to go to specify those online competencies shortly, but we've got a couple of slides here, looking at those topics of the learning objectives, the context and the content, and the affect and behaviours. So back to you, Cathy.
Thank you. So let's look at adapting learning objectives. So one of the challenges is, if the learning objective in the original scenario is a learner must demonstrate a certain psychomotor skill, how are they going to do that online when they're not able to be in the presence of an SP? So there's a few workaround solutions that have been developed that the SP hands the findings to the learner when cued, or the SP might play a video that displays signs and symptoms, or the SP uses a narrative style. For example, if the learner says, I'm examining your eye now, the SP might say, this is what you would see if you examined my eye. And let's say the SP had pink eye or had an injury to their eye. And so what's really important here is to orient both the learners and the SPs to how to work in this environment. And so the learner would need to be briefed to state what they would do, and that the SP would respond with further data. And Debra, I'm wondering if you want to jump in and talk about what that would look like.
Yeah, just for example, for years in real person SP work, we've often had participants saying things like, now I'm going to examine your head. And actually that's all we need them to say. They don't actually need to then do a description of what that examination might entail. So we're going back to some quite old practices. And Cathy, I'm just going to that first solution that's listed on the slide about the SP handing the finding to the learner when cued. Is this done on a visual field with holding up to camera the written text?
Yes, it can be, or the SP could send the learner a link in the chat box. I've seen that done as well.
Okay, I can see that that's quite complex in terms of if you're attending just to the screen, managing the chat as well. So not easy solutions, but I'm loving the creativity around them. I might move to the next slide now.
Okay. So the next challenge is to adapt both the context and the content. So what do we mean by that? So the challenge is that the encounter is set in an in-person environment, but it's being done online. So one of the solutions is, can the encounter be adapted to a setting that makes sense for the medium? So as I described about the neuropsychology simulation that we developed, it's an actual telehealth setting, as opposed to putting the scenario online, but everybody has to pretend that they're actually in person. That can really disrupt the learners' engagement and also the SP's engagement. It isn't possible for all settings, but when it can be done, there are many reports in the literature that this is the best almost solution because it mimics the reality of the setting. I don't know, Debra, if you wanted to say anything more about that.
Yeah, I find a real tension here because I really, certainly when I first pivoted to online, I found that we were actually really pretending that we were still doing the work in person. And I think there's going to be a happy medium, Cathy. It's a little bit like doing drills for, if you're training for sports. I think that there are still some, for example, communication skills that you can learn online, in this online context, that we can be pretending that we're in a face-to-face clinical setting. So I guess what I'm coming to say is that we don't need to move everything to a telehealth environment when we're working online. We can still, the skills that are used will still be invaluable. I mean, if you think about it, we have tabletop simulations, which invite people to think that they're in a completely different environment than they are. Our virtual reality simulations do the same thing. So I think it's okay for us to have some scenarios that are absolutely developed for telehealth, but we can still work online to develop a whole range of important communication, professional and other skills for clinical practice with our SPs. So yeah, there's a real tension though, isn't there?
Yes, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense what you're saying as well. So then another challenge, can we just go back one?
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Another challenge is, and I'll just briefly say this, but many cases may have been written prior to COVID-19, and they may not be, that setting them within COVID-19 might not make sense or provide a lot of distractors. And I'm thinking about one organization I work with, so it's high stakes testing. And so one of the workarounds that we developed is that the SP has strategies to guide the learner away from asking questions. So today I'm just here about this because there's a limited amount of time that the learner has or the candidate has in the station, and or briefing the candidate or the learner to that you do not consider COVID-19 when you interact with the SP in this scenario. And another alternative, because it really just depends on the context. So another way of looking at this is, can the scenario be modified to account for COVID-19? And again, it's hitting us all in different ways all around the world. So it's just something to consider. Next. Oh, sorry, Debra.
Yep, thank you very much. I'm just conscious of time and pushing us along there to this one. Great.
Okay, thank you. So also considerations for adapting SP affect and behaviors in the slide. So if the role has a dynamic affect or behaviors, pacing or lots of large gestures, it could mean that the SP would be out of the camera frame, or the camera would go out of focus. So is there a way that you can suggest that without having to do it in the same way that you would do in person? You may also have to provide moulage kits and instruction for SPs and send it to them, via FedEx. That's what we would do here in Toronto. So that's important as well if the SP has moulage or the SP has a physical appearance or affect. Whereas when we did it face-to-face, there'd be someone there doing it for them. There may have to be time devoted to teaching them how to do it or coaching them how to do it, and or looking and seeing, is there any way that you can adapt those affects or physical behaviors or physical appearance on camera? And another workaround as well is where the SP might play a video that displays the signs and symptoms without them having to have full moulage.
Oh, thanks very much, Cathy. Again, such creative solutions to what are very real challenges. And just drawing attention to these online competencies. I know, Cathy, you've worked with these.
Well, and this is, again, I alluded to this a little earlier, but thinking about not all people are starting at the same place, but a colleague of ours from ASPE, there was a webinar, and again, we put the URL there, so there's much more information where this is from, but she thought of it as organizing it into basic and advanced competencies. And with each of these, there are tasks and the kinds of sessions that would be appropriate for those tasks. So I won't go through all of these. You can read these later. But for example, at a basic task, they're able to call in on a Zoom call and turn their microphone on and adjust their camera. So that may be appropriate for very basic history or basic cases, and where the SP educator or trainer is close by just in case. Whereas more advanced competencies might involve they are able to actually go in a breakout room, monitor a chat room, share screen documents as we talked about, use the chat function to file share. And that might be more appropriate for live dynamic delivery in more complex sessions, or where there are more SPs involved, or they may have to work a little bit more independently. And again, we all have started to learn this, Debra, to use your word again, creative solutions. And SPs, many SPs I work with who were, not comfortable working online, they've really adapted. And as have the educators that work with them. So it's a really marvelous thing to see how resilient and adaptable we've all become.
Oh, thanks very much, Cathy. And of course, these competencies have relevance for faculty and for our learners as well. So another quick pause. And now we're going to work with the briefing phase, having done the preparing phase and thinking about the considerations that you might have to make to your usual practice with SPs, but this time to work online. And one of the purposes of briefing is to establish psychological safety. And this is essential for optimal learning. And it's something that we need to work at. We just can't tell people that, well, we can tell people something's psychologically safe, but that's kind of meaningless because each individual determines whether it's a safe space for them. It's also a dynamic, it's a feeling. And so while you might feel psychologically safe at the beginning, this doesn't necessarily continue throughout the entire encounter with the learners. So as faculty, as educators, we have to be really cognizant of the safety for our learners and also of our SPs. You can see from Michaela Colby, there's a description of what psychological safety is there. It's the perception that it's safe to take interpersonal risks and that no one will be embarrassed, rejected, or otherwise punished for speaking their mind, not knowing or asking questions. So it's not something that comes easily to people, and it's something in that we know to optimize learning, we have to really pay attention to. And just highlighting there the role that educators need to take in because of the very emotional, often, not always, but often the emotional stakes with SP work can be quite high. And so where we have particular attention to be paid here. I'm just going to go to the bottom bullet point there about the SP educator, the facilitator, setting the tone for both what's said and how it's said. And in any of the simulation practices we do, we just have to be attentive to this. Privacy can be a really important element of creating psychological safety in any of our simulation practices. And of course, when we go online, as faculty, we have much less control over the privacy of those settings. So it is a consideration that flows through all of the simulation phases. We've just positioned it here within the briefing. But we've thought about some guidelines for participating online, and in terms of setting that tone, welcoming your participants as they arrive online, having friendly conversations with them, really valuable to put them at ease. This is all part of creating that psychological safety. My sense is to encourage cameras on, particularly if we're doing communications type scenarios. However, I respect that in some circumstances that's not always going to be possible. There may be technology compromises, but sometimes it's going to be essential. So working out for your session what's right, but ensuring that people know what that is in advance. Possibly having microphones off when not in conversation, but it depends how large the group is and how much synchronous conversation may be taking place. I think it's really important to remind participants that there's an opportunity to have a call out, a timeout, and sometimes just using one of the icons on screen, it could be the raised hand, be the indication for a timeout. You may want to brief SPs separately within the platform that you're working with. We've mentioned the privacy already, but just a couple of helpful questions that you may want to ask your participants. This is either your participants can use this in the simulation, but even as we're just checking out with our colleagues, anyone with you at home today, do you think anyone can hear what we're saying? Also having the facilitator having a screen background that states that this is a simulation. So if anyone was to walk in on these spaces, it's clear that they're not walking into a medical consultation, for example. Use the chat space as much as you can, share protocols, immediate reflections, share observer forms, use polling functions. I do think it's a big ask if a learner is in the simulation to be expecting them to monitor the chat space as well as talking. But for observers, absolutely use that space. And something I found useful is that during the simulation, only the learner and the SP had their cameras on. I think while it's often okay for the learner, for the SP, it's easier for them to focus on the person that they're meant to be speaking to. So they're just a few practices that I've come across. But I'm wondering, Cathy, you make this very important point about setting expectations.
Yes, we're working with so many different people, and it's really important to get everybody on the same page about how the simulation is going to work and who has what role. So this it goes back to the preparation phase, but it takes time to really work out this and making sure that everybody is clear.
So important, and I'm glad that you're including everyone in that statement. Thanks, Cathy. Now on to the final phase that we're working with in part one, and it's that simulation phase, thinking about the considerations, the adaptations that you may have to do for work, online work with SPs. And of course, this will have been trained within the preparation phase. But we've just chosen to position it here as a reminder for everyone involved that there will be verbal considerations, the pace, the projection of volume of talk, the articulation that SPs may need, and indeed learners may need to be paying more attention to these factors. And the physical behaviours as well. Cathy has already mentioned the ensuring that all participants stay within the frame of the camera. The minimising of extraneous movements. I worked with a colleague in a workshop earlier this week, and she's so animated, and her hands kept going across the screen a million times. And she had she was doing this really wonderful thing where in Zoom there's this function that you can turn off your own camera whilst everyone else can still see you. And there's some evidence to suggest that it takes some of the cognitive load and the stress of working in simulation off by not being able to see yourself, because that's not what we usually do. But it also has this other impact, is that you can't see what other people are seeing. So beware of that. The distance from camera, important, eye contact, awareness of facial expressions and so on. Oh, just a little bit more consideration, but try to keep things simple. And there's that challenge of not talking over the learner as well. You can see we've got our lines crossed through two of the other points there, which you can read. They sit much more with that training phase, but we just wanted to flag that these are some of the considerations for SPs within the simulation itself. A couple of extra facilitator guidelines. Again, ensuring the seating's appropriate for the SP and for the learner, to observe for being really careful to attend to observing for if a timeout has been called by anyone. I know when I'm looking on screen, I don't always see the hand go up to indicate that. But because of those verbal and physical considerations that you're going to be making as faculty, you've got to be extra attentive to difficulties that may arise for anyone online, and to have a plan of action for how you're going to manage that. If you're working in large groups, then absolutely, I'm going to say essential to have a co-facilitator or tech person to support you. If you have to communicate with the SP for various reasons during the session, then to use the chat space. But again, being cognizant of the very heavy cognitive load that can take. And I've also taken to using phone messaging. It just has a different way of attracting attention for the SP, and to ensure observers are clear about their tasks as well. But just remembering that teleconference fatigue is a real thing, and virtual interactions can be just really demanding. When we communicate, we derive meaning from our verbal and our physical cues and our paralinguistic cues. So these are all a little bit compromised in our video communication. Cathy, is there anything else that you'd like to add here?
I think that it's important, if SPs are working all day, that you provide them with breaks, and some strategies is looking away from the camera every 20 minutes for 20 seconds, getting them to change posture, because it can be a very long day on Zoom. And we'll talk more about this in terms of debriefing and de-rolling SPs in part 2 as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. If you are working with telehealth as part of the simulation activity, I've noticed that a number of professional societies have produced guidelines, and there are some really wonderful technical tips that feed into our online simulations as well. So here are just 2 examples, but there are many available, and would encourage you to take a look. Again, we'll make these slides available so you can simply click on the links to access them easily. We're just moving into some closing remarks now, and one of the things that's underpinning everything that we do in our simulation, any of our simulation, but especially our online simulation, is that everyone's safety is paramount. We cannot assume psychological safety. We have to work hard at it. There are a couple of other references that we wanted to draw attention to. The first is the Manifesto for Healthcare Simulation Practice. This was developed in response to COVID-19 and some of the challenges that individuals around the world were experiencing with their simulation practice across different simulation modalities, but particularly for simulated participants. So we direct you to that and to this terrific article that relates to the manifesto relating to, and here the focus is very much on SP safety and autonomy. So 2 really helpful references. So Cathy, I'm going to turn back to you just to recap our learning objectives.
Thanks, Debra. So in this session, we outlined fundamental considerations in SP-based education, and we used the simulation phases model to think about that. We also described the nature and type of SP-based scenarios that could be delivered via simulation and considerations for how to prepare for those in terms of developing the scenarios, creative workarounds for the scenarios, and also preparing SPs, facilitators, and learners to work within those scenarios. And we discussed adaptations for SPs, faculty, administrators, and learners within the actual scenarios. We also provided and outlined strategies to monitor and maintain psychological safety of all those involved. And again, we'll just repeat it one more time, how important it is. And I think one of the things that came home for me is, I heard this in a webinar, but that the SPs are in their homes and as our learners and facilitators. So they're doing these scenarios in their homes. So that adds an additional layer of importance to why psychological safety is so important. Now I'll turn it back over to you, Debra.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you, Cathy, and thank you to those who've given us their time this morning. And I'm wishing everyone a successful conference. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, Cathy. How are you today?
I'm well. How about yourself, Debra?
Yeah, good. Just so the audience know, we've recorded this on a different day, hence I'm wearing something different in a different room as well. But Monday morning here. What about for you?
It's Sunday evening here.
Excellent. Well, I hope you've had a lovely weekend. And Cathy, I might hand over to you to get started.
Thanks, Debra. So welcome, everyone. Today, we're presenting the second part of our presentation on getting started in telesimulation with simulated patients. And again, as we mentioned in the first session, we crossed the word standardized out to highlight our preference to use the word simulated. So in part two, we are going to be focusing on feedback and debriefing, reflection, evaluation, and quality assurance.
I might just introduce myself very briefly, since we did this fully in part one, and you can see that we both have many responsibilities associated with broad healthcare simulation work, as well as specific elements of simulated patient work. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I'm based today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And it's also important that we make a verbal statement relative to our disclosures. And I think you can see that there are a couple that are located there. Over to you, Cathy.
Thank you. I won't add anything more to my own introduction. I will do an acknowledgement of land. I wish to acknowledge this land on which I am working. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land.
Oh, thank you, Cathy. That's fabulous.
So our learning objectives in this session are, by the end of this session, our hope is that you will be able to outline approaches to quality assurance in SP-based education, and you will be able to discuss adaptations of quality assurance for SPs, faculty, administrators, and learners in telesimulation, as well as strategies for monitoring and maintaining wellness of all those involved, including SPs. Debra, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And true to form, I just look at those learning objectives and think how ambitious we are in terms of what we're going to be able to achieve. I think I might, if it's okay with you, Cathy, turn off the video now so that we don't distract from the text. Is that okay?
That's great. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'll just have it come up on my screen. There we go. And I'm just going to run over 3 resources that underpin the presentations for both part 1 and part 2. We introduced these in part 1, so I'll be especially brief here. These are the nets and phases. These are considerations that you might make in any educational design for simulation practice, usually starting with preparing, but you can see there's a very tiny arrowhead there that suggests that all of the activities feed back into the preparation. So for simulated patient methodology, we've added some additional phases, the de-rolling after a simulated patient has been in a simulation, and after evaluating, and perhaps before the SPs leave the facility, that they are debriefed and perhaps some further de-rolling. And we'll talk to that a little bit later in this session, because the text in blue from debriefing and feedback, reflecting, evaluating, and debriefing and de-rolling is the focus of today's presentation. So that's the first resource. The second are the standards of so-called best practice from the ASPE organization. This is a professional society based in the US that has some really valuable resources about SP practices, and that I find them really helpful just as a guide to my practice because they are highly contextual. And the third is, and this is where I declare one of those disclosures, I am editor-in-chief of this book, Simulated Patient Methodology, Theory, Evidence and Practice, and it certainly will inform a number of elements of today's session in terms of the more generic aspects of SP methodology. Cathy, back to you.
Thanks, Debra. So just a reminder about what we mean when we use the term simulated participants. We're mainly referring to simulated patients. They are defined as individuals who are well and who are carefully trained to portray a person in some sort of healthcare scenario. And the person is usually a patient, but it could also be a family member or another healthcare professional. They are commonly found in OSCEs, but also in a whole host of other supportive learning practices. And just a reminder that SPs not only portray roles, they're also able to provide feedback on their experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in this session and how it applies to telesimulation.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. I really love hearing you talk about the way that you position SPs, and I certainly have this role when they're in this perception that when they're in that patient role, that they really are proxies for patients, not proxies for clinicians, but proxies for patients, which means that we need to really think about all of the elements that feed into the way that they portray the role and the nature of the feedback they offer. But here we are with the sorts of words that are used to describe online practices, and the Society for Simulation in Healthcare have come up with a number, and you'll see various terms in the literature: virtual simulation, telesimulation, distance simulation, remote simulation, and even more refined practices like virtual debriefing. So I'm sitting just with this notion of online SP-based work, even though we have in the title used the phrase telesimulation. I just wanted you to hold those terms in your head, though, rather than us describing them. And so in detail, what we're referring to are pretty much various combinations of SPs, learners and faculty who are working through some sort of communication platform, and the one that I've used with most commonly is Zoom. And we're assuming that all are working through the platform, but it's possible that some of these individuals, the SPs, the learners or the faculty, could actually be in the same room. But we're working on the assumption that at least one group is separate. And the purpose of this is that we're supporting learning or assessment. And indeed, it could be that we're supporting the preparatory work for the subsequent online simulations, or it could be that we're also considering elements of the debriefing and the de-rolling of the SPs. So it's not just the simulation itself. And this is what it might look like: a facilitator as an SP participant, learner, and then some observers. But many different combinations of what this might be. And Cathy, I wonder, have you got an example from your practice from last year?
Yes, so one that comes to mind is with a group of older SPs that I work with. And by that, I mean they're over the age of 60. And when COVID struck, we didn't do a lot of online work. And we realized very quickly that we needed to figure out a way to create a sense of connection and keep up the training that we had done with them. So we developed weekly sessions, and this is the reference if you're interested, and that is in an open source journal. Looking at their well-being, we developed a weekly intervention, or session, I should say, where we did a mindfulness exercise, and then we did storytelling, and we'd have a topic that we did every week, such as talk about a friendship from your childhood. And each of them would take a turn reminiscing about this, and then others would join in. And we found that it really built a lot of their SB skills, as well as helped with their sense of connection and purpose. So I invite you to look at that article if you want to get further information about it. Debra, you have some examples?
I did, and I just want to say that this is such a lovely example of this whole notion of online simulation being more than just the simulation activity itself. It's all that stuff that you do as faculty to support your SPs, and this is such a beautiful example. So thanks for sharing it, and delighted that it's been able to be published in the Open Access Journal. I'm going to refer to OSCEs, and unlike Cathy, I haven't written up and published the work that I've done in this field. But one example is looking at online OSCEs from my personal experience of surgical training. Logistically, it was hugely challenging of putting an OSCE online. But once those processes have been established, it's really a very interesting and I say economically feasible approach. And of course, there are strengths and limitations with it, and multiple layers of security, depending on whether they're high stakes or formative OSCEs. But I've been amazed with what can be achieved. And I just share with you, we're clearly not the only person doing this work, that there have been a number of publications associated with the online OSCEs. And you see tremendous variations in some of the OSCEs. The candidates stay in one room and the examiners and the SPs move, but in others, the candidates move rooms and so on. Fabulously thoughtful use of the Zoom function for sharing station prompts, for examiners sharing screens, the co-hosts recording, renaming breakout rooms according to the OSCE station number, and so on, and being able to use the broadcasting function of the start and finish times. So I think it's something that's going to stay with us for a long time. And I'm just going to kind of move I am moving to the next slide, and it's really to help us think about this shift in our practices, that what we once did live, we had to move to online as a band-aid measure. But now we've actually found that it's been so productive in some areas that it's going to be embedded in my practice hereafter. So it's really important that we think of valuable ways to maintain this. So here we are in part 2, just a reminder of those NetSim phases, that we're going to be focused on just the elements of written in blue, because we've done the other kind of from midnight through to about 5 o'clock in the part 1 session. And if I start with the debriefing and feedback, thinking about the sorts of considerations that we need to make for online work, I know that some people say that debriefing and feedback is the most important phase in simulation. I actually don't agree with that. I don't think you can pull out one particular phase and say it's the most important. I think it's the sum that contribute. Some components might resonate more with learners, but for different purposes. And SPs are going to be making valuable contributions throughout the entire NetSim phases. And it's really important in the debriefing and feedback that we have to actively bring SPs into the conversation. In part 1, we spoke about psychological safety as being really important to optimize learning. Well, we want to emphasize that again, and it's not just the learners for whom psychological safety is important. It's also the SPs, it's also the faculty, and this is a dynamic process. It's something that we have to work actively at. Even if we establish psychological safety in the briefing, it doesn't mean that it's sustained through the simulation activity and into the debriefing. I think during the debriefing, where discussion takes place about the quality and nature of the performance, you can see it's a fairly high risk area for breaches of psychological safety. But if we do engage with our colleagues, including our SPs, because I see them as our colleagues in this activity, that if we engage with them with total respect and curiosity and with that intent to improve practices, then it's going to be much easier to sustain psychological safety. I think if I hand back to you, Cathy, to hear you talk about that really important first step of inviting your SPs to come out of role in that debriefing.
Yes, Debra, thank you. And I think this follows on your points made about psychological safety, that before the SP gives feedback, once the simulation is over, it's important to establish a pause for them so that they can literally step out of role and take the role off that they have assumed. It's almost like they're shedding a skin or shedding a coat, especially if the role involves heavy emotions. Otherwise, it can be very difficult for them to give feedback in a constructive way. So if they've been playing somebody who's highly upset and they start giving feedback from that stance, it can be really upsetting for the learners to hear. And it can also be upsetting for the SPs. So they really need a moment to clear their heads. And this is a term, or this is a technique that actually came from drama therapy and psychology. And it's a technique that can be used by actors, and it should be used more by actors. It isn't always used, but they probably will understand it, professional actors as well, because it really helps people to just leave behind what they don't need to carry forward so that they can fully move in to supporting the learner to the best of their ability from the perspective of the person that they represented. And I think the next slide demonstrates some of the ways that you can do this online. And it's, again, keeping in mind when you're online, you're sitting in front of a camera and it just may be your face and shoulders that are framed. And so if you can turn the camera off, taking a mindful pause, even a breath. And these are some other ideas. I won't read through them here now, but they're ideas that it would be very important for the trainer or the SP educator to establish with the SP and with the facilitator, so the facilitator understands what's going on in that moment. It's also very helpful for the learners to do this as well, just to take a moment to step out of the simulation and to reset for the debriefing phase, the feedback that the SPs will provide, and the debriefing phase.
Cathy, I just want to draw attention to that renaming self. I think that's such an important component on the, for example, the Zoom function. So initially the SP would have had the SP role name and then change that name as they come back into the debriefing to their own. But what a fabulous, a really powerful way to become themselves again.
Yes, and very simple. And that also demands that in the training that the SPs understand how to do that, especially if they're new to Zoom, although I think all of us are much more familiar with it now than we were 18 months ago. And just, you'll see even little things here with your body, like leaning back, leaning to one side, leaning to the other, taking a drink of water. These are all ways that you can reset your inner thermostat, so to speak, and signal that you're in a different space right now.
I'm going to move on to the next slide for adaptations for SP feedback online. So, Cathy, over to you again.
Yes, and we have adaptations in square brackets because when you're considering how SPs will give feedback and what they will say, it's the same process as if they were face-to-face. However, when you're doing it online, you have to think through the logistics of it and what the timing of it will be, what the sequence will be, how the SPs will be briefed, how the learners will be briefed, and the facilitators, and how to frame the feedback as part of a conversation within the process of the debrief of the learners. And I also want to point out, in this section, the learners are being debriefed, not the SPs. The debriefing of the SPs, as we saw in the model of the phases of simulation, will come later, and we'll talk about that later. And so there are some very straightforward ways to think about doing this. So as we talked about, the SPs will introduce themselves to the learners using their actual name, and will put their actual name into the rename themselves in the Zoom platform if you're using that. They will step out of role and introduce themselves, so they are providing feedback out of character. They are giving feedback. They portrayed the person they were representing. They are giving feedback from their perspective, but they are signaling they are not in role. Other things like looking directly at the person they are giving feedback to, and that can demand some training, especially if you're on a gallery view, because it can be really disconcerting to get feedback if the SP is looking down at the corner of the screen. One of my colleagues, the SPs had reported that the SPs had monitors and cameras where the camera was at the bottom of the screen rather than the top of the screen. And they were looking at the top of the screen, but their eyes weren't making contact with the learners. So that was a learning they got from that particular session. And then also, as always, that the SPs and their feedback are guided by what the learning objectives are of the session, by the learners' reactions to what they are saying, and by faculty input and their experience of the learner during simulation. One thing that can sometimes happen in this session, in this kind of session, is that the learner or the facilitator can say something like, well, that's not what happened. And the SP has the opportunity to be able to say, well, from my experience, this is what I experienced. And that's the power of the SP's feedback, so that they are not arguing with anyone. They are giving feedback from their perspective and holding that space. And then also thinking about how learners might present on camera and how that might affect the learner. So if there's low light, or if they were having difficulty making eye contact, or other technical difficulties, that the SP takes that into account in their feedback. And that's thought about when they're being trained, so they understand how to react to this, and they are not perceived as being critical for things that might be perhaps outside the learner's control.
Oh, thanks, Cathy. And again, that's one of those principles in whatever forum that we're working with, but perhaps highlighted when we're online. I'm just going to move to debriefing and feedback approaches. And, wow, that's a lot of references. It is to say that, really just a reminder that there are so many different approaches to incorporating feedback and debriefing into our simulation practice. Some, increasingly, these are generic, and by that I'm saying that they don't necessarily incorporate SP methodology. But there's no reason from my perspective that I can see that they would not be relevant. There's one of the references, in fact, there are two references here that are outside of simulation, the one led by Johnson and the one by Malloy, and they're about feedback in clinical settings. And I really like the way that we can think about some of these approaches to feedback and debriefing actually cutting across our simulation and our real clinical setting practice. So you're going to have access to these slides. You'll be able to click on the links and go directly to these references. And you'll see that there are many similarities within them, but this is for generic simulation debriefing practice. And so we're not going to do anything further there, but we didn't want to leave you without any further guidance. These are two references that are very specific to online debriefing. And again, they are open access, so you can click on the link directly. Again, they are not necessarily relating to SP methodology, but they have wide application. So I encourage you to take a look at those. And we might just pause now for Cathy to check in with the live audience as to any questions. So back again in the reflection phase. So this is the reflection phase is essential for participants to really internalize the learning. Anyone involved in the simulation can reflect, and the purpose is really that individual meaning making that we have of all of the events that have preceded where we are at the moment. So that's the briefing, the simulation, the debriefing and feedback, but everything else that we've brought to this session. And we as individuals are in the best position to know what we might take forward for ourselves. And whilst we have the reflection phases coming after the debriefing and feedback, it could actually fit a tiny bit after the briefing when a simulation scenario is introduced, encouraging participants, particularly learners, to think about the particular simulation that they're going to be participating in. How have they managed this in the past? What were their strengths? What were their areas of development? Any particular challenges that they would like to focus on. So reflection is really threaded through all of the NetSim phases, but we position it after the debriefing and feedback to encourage learners to kind of almost feed forward, to take forward into their practice what they might do in future. And Cathy, I might, I'll just stay with this slide. This comes from the standards of best practice, and there's this lovely statement about reflecting on your training, but on really any aspect of your simulation practice is a really important quality assurance measure. So not only is it about advancing our individual practice, but it's about understanding how we might improve our simulation practice. So as we move, so I just want to say that reflection is very much individual work. Okay? It's sitting with individuals, and it may not necessarily be sharing with others, but what it will feed into is the evaluation phase. So again, when we're using the term evaluation here, we're using it in the sense of, did this simulation activity meet the learning objectives that we had in mind when we set it up? So this is not about measuring individual performance or assessing individual performance. It's about evaluating that quality assurance process of the simulation activity itself. And of course, any of the participants or stakeholders involved in the simulation will feed to this. And today we're really just going to focus on the quality assurance components. So Cathy, I might hand back to you for this part.
Thanks, Debra. So in this stage, again, it's adapting what we might do in face-to-face strategies. And most important is seeking timely feedback from all stakeholders. And this could be verbal or it could be written. And technology can really be helpful here. So the use of online polls, QR codes, comments in chat boxes, adapting existing questionnaires. We'll show you an example of one in just one moment. We also just want to point out at the bottom of this slide that this is an article on tips for conducting telesimulation-based medical education that is very recent, and it is open source as well. And it's really about getting feedback from everyone in the circle. Debra, could you just go to the next slide, please?
Sure.
Yes. So this is an example of an SP evaluation form for an online session that is available and that you could adapt to your settings. And you can see there's a Likert scale there from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and a number of different statements. So this is around the use of Zoom, but it could also be around how prepared the SPs felt, for example, for their training session, how effectively the learners feel the session was in meeting the learning needs or the objectives, as well as how effectively the facilitators feel that the session worked from their perspective. And getting comments from people about what they think went well and what they might do differently next time can be very valuable as well. And other adaptations to promote quality assurance. I can't stress enough from my experience, it's the development of explicit policies and procedures with clear expectations. And working online is different from working face-to-face, and people have different mental models of how to work online. So lining up all of the people, so the learners, the facilitators, the SPs, and the educators, so everybody understands how things will work moving forward. And this takes time to do. Also, recruiting the right SPs for the right job. Not all SPs can do all work. And we talked about competencies in part 1. So really making sure that the SPs that you've recruited for the job are able to do it, and that they have the appropriate equipment, and that they are prepared as well. And also, and this goes back to what we talked about in part 1, reviewing and modifying scenarios in collaboration with the subject matter experts who created them to ensure that they are going to work online, and in response to feedback you might get from the evaluation to adapt the scenarios moving forward. And then it can also be helpful that you develop explicit criteria for what do you mean by role readiness? And we will include an example of that in the slides. We won't talk about that today. And Debra, I'll let you go forward. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
I look forward to sharing the slides because we've got that fabulous work that you've done, Cathy, relative to the role readiness and that adaptation for online work. But Cathy, I think you're going to talk to the debriefing and de-rolling of SPs.
Oops. Thank you, Debra. So this phase is so important for so many reasons. So first of all, it offers the SPs a final opportunity to de-roll and shed the role. Also, in terms of debriefing them and using the same kinds of processes that you use with learners, and not a lot of research has been done on this with SPs. There's a little bit written. People often say it's important to debrief the SPs. So how you do it, you can go to those earlier resources that we provided for you, but it offers you an opportunity to check in and see if the SPs, what they learned, what they got out of it, offers an opportunity for further evaluation. And also you can pick up things where maybe there are gaps in your training or in their understanding of what they're supposed to do, or even maybe what went on with facilitators or learners so that you can improve processes and communication with them. And Debra, can you put the slide forward, please? Yeah. So again, through this, I just want to point this out. I think it's such an important statement. When they're working from home, they are not working from home. They are at their home during a crisis trying to work. And this comes from a webinar, and we've given you access to it that may give you lots of strategies for ensuring the wellness of the SPs, but especially if they're playing a role with a lot of emotional affect, they may need support to come down from that, and or if they have to give feedback that's challenging, or the situation, or the session hasn't gone well. They're not in a sim center where you can talk to them face to face and they can go off. They can be at home and they can be sitting there stewing in it for quite a while if you don't develop techniques to help them separate from that experience. Next slide, please, Debra.
Oh, I just wanted to remind people, I just wanted to remind people that Zoom can be very fatiguing, and we mentioned this in the first part as well. So we've left the slide in here really just as a prompt, but it's an important quality assurance consideration. So we direct you to take a look at this. And then there were a couple of debriefing adaptations with SPs online. I know Cathy has spoken to some of these, but we really do need to consider some of the logistics around working with SPs online. I know many of the SPs that I work, and I don't want to speak in stereotypic terms, but some of my much older SPs have found it really difficult to navigate payment systems, for example, through online. So even working online has been almost, a challenge too great for some people. So I know that some of them are really looking forward to getting back to some of the in-person work. And we're also thinking that during some of that in-person work, we may be able to coach them to be able to work online as well. But sometimes it's just hard to do that coaching online. The notions of having a dedicated breakout room, really valuable. That structured debriefing session for SPs in a breakout room. Again, ensuring that SPs are not just logging off without having shared their role completely. Ensuring there's a contact number, asking how did the session go for you today, really individualising, personalising, placing that SP at the centre of your attention is really valuable. And just some additional de-rolling strategies after the online session. You can see these here: plan, call a friend, take a walk, watch a funny show, do some journaling, meditate, shed a piece of clothing, do whatever. Let your SPs know these things so that that could be something that works for them. So as we move to our closing remarks, I just want to remind everyone that safety, and here we're talking mainly psychological safety, is absolutely paramount in all of those net sim phases, but in all of our simulation practice, irrespective of the simulation framework we're working with. And for our online participation, this just raises levels, types of cues that may be less visible to our in-person presence. And one of the most notable ones for me is that remembering to give everybody a voice and to introduce themselves, that really important discipline. We've included a reference here, the Manifesto for Healthcare Simulation Practice, developed in response to what was happening during COVID, and really setting some, I'm going to say, standards, but I don't mean in a regulatory sort of way, but a guidance for us to be thinking about the challenges, the positions, the pressures that we may be placing on all of our healthcare practitioners, students, and indeed those who support their learning. It's a very international group of individuals who've contributed to that work. We also have a response to that article led by Lou Clark there, who focuses in on the importance of keeping our SPs safe. And really just to run over the learning objectives, the first being to outline approaches to quality assurance in SP-based education, and to discuss adaptations of quality assurance for SPs, faculty, administrators, and learners in telesimulation, and to outline strategies for monitoring and maintaining wellness of all those involved, but particularly SPs. So SPs have been our focus across part 1 and part 2, and we've maintained almost all of the same principles that we work with in our in-person simulated patient work. But there are nuanced differences because our practices are screen mediated and we're not responding to the usual cues that we might have if it was a live simulation. Well, it is a live simulation, but if we were in person, in part because of the much more limited view that we have of individuals. And just remembering that really small thing, that we only have a view of the individual in the screen. We don't know what's going on in their background and what pressures may be influencing the way that they're engaging in the activity. So I hope that we've been able to provide a number of measures that will support your practice. And I'd like to just hand back to Cathy to see if there's anything further that she would like to add.
I think the one thing that I would like to add is that the more you can make your expectations clear in writing, the more successfully my experience has been, the more successful the simulation is. And it's iterative. You learn new things every time you do it. And I want to really thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Cathy. That's fantastic. And I wish everyone who's listening good luck as they work with their online simulations. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias para la doctora Cathy. Estamos un poco presionados del tiempo para las preguntas, pero estoy seguro que le van a mandar como muchas preguntas a través del contacto que nos dejó. Le quiero dar la palabra al doctor Eric López para que continuemos con la siguiente presentación.
Hola, buenas tardes. Como parte de la siguiente actividad dentro del